My talk today is called The Creation of 21st Century Public Infrastructure, Beauty, Economics, Politics, and Ecology. A lot of my work has to do with, I want to start by saying I have a practice called D-Land Studio, and I also teach at a number of different schools. But I like to say that we created a new paradigm of practice, at least for the US, where we think about climate, economy, community, ecology, water, infrastructure, and we bring all these things together. And I like to say we make it up and we make it happen because we are often the originators of projects. We don't wait for a project proposal to come to us. We make them up. And I'll explain that in a moment. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of history because a lot of the shape of the American landscape relates to its political structures. Thomas Jefferson basically created the land ordinance grid. He sold off the land in the United States in order to run the country. I'm going to need to go faster on these if we're going to get through this in 50 minutes. What he did was actually create this system called the Jefferson Land Ordinance Act of 1785, which parceled out the United States into territories, townships, and sections. And what that did is it provided income for the country. But 100 years later, President Lincoln created the Homestead Act of 1862. And the important difference between the Land Ordinance Act and the Homestead Act is that Thomas Jefferson basically made the land available to people who could afford it, and they tended to be white men. Lincoln made land available to everyone by allowing freed slaves to own land and allowing women to own land. And he also set up structures of credit so that smaller parcels could be sold to the population. So it created a different kind of pattern. So I just want you to look at this pattern that is very indicative of the way the American landscape has been shaped, both by these bureaucratic structures, but also by technological structures with these irrigation rings. So later in the 20th century, I'm jumping ahead, Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the New Deal. And what this did was it created a big investment of money into public structures. So both public lands and I'm pressing, thank you, and also into new park spaces. I'm pressing again. So created all these incredible civic buildings across the United States. And he also created, through this system, a whole distributed infrastructure system, and one part of that was called the TVA, which brought power, jobs, and flood control to rural communities, this in particular in Tennessee. Okay, so this is it's important an important sort of aspect of the TVA is that water and the landscape and infrastructure have been an obsession of mine for years. When I was 14, my father, who was a geophysicist, took me on a field trip to this landscape in the Southwest. And when I was at Harvard studying landscape architecture and architecture, I got a grant to go back and look at these large water impoundment structures and think about sort of the ecologies and the differences between the landscapes on either side of these large dams. But a lot of my practice focuses on the term infrastructure. And infrastructure as a term developed in the World War II era in reference to military logistical operations. And a lot of that is a result of the work of General Eisenhower, who then became President of the United States. He was an important military general, and he created the federal highway system, investing $25 billion into our national highway defense system. And it was very important that it was called the National Highway Defense System, because that was a way that he could get the political backing to make this happen. But one of the things that's, I think, very important to think about in relation to this is it transformed the distribution of people across the country. It was actually, go next, a very significant development scheme that really led to the development of the suburb and a lot of this post-war development that we unfortunately see across the United States today. Sorry, go back. Okay. Go forward. Okay. And unfortunately, there are also representatives, so congressmen, politicians, who still consider this about economic development. Okay, now we're going to need to play the video. There you go.
The problem is, though, when our infrastructure is not being destroyed by robots and or saved by Bruce Willis, we tend to find it a bit boring.
As you know, infrastructure is not a sexy or glamorous topic.
As much as I'd like to think otherwise, infrastructure is not sexy.
Infrastructure is not very sexy.
Yes, infrastructure, like those men we just heard from, is important but not sexy.
So I love this clip by John Oliver because it really speaks to what I'm trying to do, which is to make infrastructure much more sexy. Let's go next. There you go. And it's not a new idea because actually we had another president, Lyndon Bird Johnson, who signed the Highway Beautification Act, ironically the year I was born, to basically bring beauty to our highways, to get rid of the billboards that littered the highways across the country. Let's go next. And create a more beautiful landscape. Next. But a lot of the work that I do relates to the confluence or the juxtaposition of these roads and these watersheds. Next. And a lot of the work I do in New York City relates to something called green infrastructure, or trying to absorb more of the surface water runoff to take it off of or out of the combined sewer systems, out of the sanitary sewer systems. Next. And this green infrastructure is something that we're working on all over the city. Next. And one of the reasons we think that's important is that I'm actually from Vermont originally, and a lot of our infrastructure is located adjacent to water systems. And when it fails, we can have these really disastrous consequences. Next. So I think I want to sort of rethink how we consider infrastructure. And just before you press that button, this is a competition we did for rethinking sort of the whole urban structure of Montreal. But ultimately, it's really about thinking about the systems that have created that city. Next, or you can press the button. So we were asked to create a connection from the airport to the center of the city, and we decided to think about all of North American infrastructure. Now, we were trying to restitch the city back together with this project we called Infosutures, and it's relatively easy to do that in an animated cartoon, but now I'm going to show you how we've been doing that in New York City. Okay. So I think there's a new awareness of urban hydrology, and I think that has happened in part because of the extreme climate impacts that we've had from large storms, but I think it's also, happily, there have been major changes because of legislation that was signed by Richard Nixon. In 1972, he signed the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and he also created something called the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. And those agencies and those acts have enabled a lot of the work that I do. Let's go next. But the other really important player in the work that I do is a mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, whose Plan YC proposal, which was kind of a big big document of guiding principles for the city of New York, that helped to inspire and also helped to motivate the public agencies to actually pursue some of the projects that I'm undertaking. Let's go next. And so with that, I'm going to begin talking about some of my projects. There are 772 U.S. cities that have combined sewer systems. Next. So Thomas Crapper did not invent the flush toilet, but he was a plumber who actually popularized it. And because he popularized the flush toilet, which had a lot of liquid in it, it ended up putting a lot of additional effluent into our sewer system. And so the combined sewer was born. I've read reports in Germany, I've read reports in France, but that technology born in Europe was soon imported to the US and to lots of communities around the world. Let's go next. And this is what happens when you get sanitary sewage combining with storm water runoff, and it ends up pouring into our waterways. Next. And the way that works is normally the sewage from domestic, commercial, and industrial sources will be treated by a sewage treatment plant. But when you have too much water going into the system during a wet weather event, then you get the combined effluent going into the waterways. Next. So what I'm trying to do with this first project is actually absorb that water. And this project is called the Sponge Park because we're using the landscape to absorb water. Next. So this project is in the Gowanus area of Brooklyn. Gowanus is now cool. It wasn't all that cool necessarily when I started. But you can see that in 1766, the whole area was a swamp, and it was transformed over time into an industrial landscape. And now it's really a post-industrial landscape. Next. And so what we want to do is bring back some of that absorptive quality of the swamp to what is now a very paved landscape and create the Sponge Park. Next. So we work on a lot of global issues, but we do our work through small local pilot projects. And in that way, we create replicable systems that when they're replicated on a large basis can have a big impact. And we do the work in a really unique way of applying for grant funding to sort of get projects going and then to create the drawings and then to facilitate the construction and then even to create maintenance manuals for the long-term stewardship of the projects. So for the Sponge Park, it was entirely grant funded, and it was something that the public agencies really weren't excited about pursuing initially, but ultimately they kind of had to because so many community people were for it, and because we had raised all the money, and because it was a pilot project. Let's go next. So this is the Gowanus edge. Next. You can see that it's a degraded edge, and then we also have all this surface water runoff that collects on the streets. Next. And all of that water washes down to the street end, and it brings with it a lot of oil and dirt and and garbage. And if you look here on the surface, this is actually raw sewage sitting on the surface of the Gowanus Canal. So, This is New York City, and it's kind of shocking to just go for a stroll in Brooklyn and find this raw sewage sitting on the top of the canal. Let's go next. So what we did was do a lot of work in section, thinking about the permeability of the ground and how we could layer public space with this new type of landscape and create more access to the waterfront. Next. And this is an example of how that might work, where you have a continuous hydrologic system going underneath a walkway with access all the way out to the water's edge. And that was very important for the boating community. Believe it or not, there is a boating community on that cesspool. And they wanted to be able to get out of their canoes at each of the street ends. So we left those open. Let's go next. So when you're working with an industrial site, one of the things that's kind of significant is that the buildings often go all the way up to the water's edge. City planning during the Bloomberg administration liked to create waterfront esplanades, and they tended to be at the water's edge with a 50-foot setback from the water. And in that space, you were intended to have pathways and benches and trees, and but it didn't really say, oh, what do you do if you have a building in the way and it happens to be an industrial site? So what we did was actually rethink the idea of the waterfront esplanade and create what we called an urban promenade. And we liked it because what it did was actually take the pathway and kind of knit it back into the community. So it doesn't just add value to the water's edge, it adds value to the entire neighborhood. And it creates an entire green district with these green infrastructure systems sort of knitting into the urban fabric. Next. And here you can see how that could transform the neighborhood. We added about 6 acres of permeable ground and public open space to the city, not including the actual street beds, which would be these new sort of important public streets. Next. And one of the things that I want to point out about working in the city, it's really complicated, and I know it's complicated here, it's complicated everywhere, but just to point out how complicated it is in this landscape, this area is the sediment underneath the canal, this isn't working either, the sediment underneath the canal is controlled by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but it became an EPA Superfund site in the middle of the design process. The first 5 feet of soil underneath the upland area is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a state agency. The surface of the ground is controlled by the Department of Transportation because it's a road. Anything green is controlled by the Parks Department. And then the water that flows over the ground is controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection. So, and then the shade over the water is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation. And then city planning also regulates how many benches you have to have, how much shade you have to have. Sometimes the benches have to have backs. It's insane how regulated this environment is. I think there were something like 200 permits we had to get for this tiny little project, this pilot project. And even within the Department of Environmental Protection, 14 agency heads had to sign off on our drawings. It was really insane. Next. But we're managing to get it done, and we're also working on a cultural redevelopment right across the way, which was part of our original master plan. So we're doing these pilots, and we're doing work for private entities to really transform this whole area. Next. And so I want to talk a little bit about the pilot project for the street end. Let's go next. So we calculated the amount of water going down to the street end, and then let's go next. And then you're going to have to press the little button for this. This is an animation of how it works. It's just a couple minutes. This explains it most easily. So there were these existing planters, let's call them. They were called green streets at the end of the block. So we're taking those out because those only took the water that fell into them. We added upland street swales. And then we also what we're doing is creating a system of bioretention cells. These are all precast concrete cells that are all interconnected, that are planted. And they have very special engineered soils within them. There's an integrated sidewalk and sedimentation basin, and then a sand filter below a walkway. And then there's a drain. So once it's gone through this whole filtration process, it goes into the Gowanus Canal. So when you get the rain coming down, some of it is captured by the upland bioswales, and then most of it is actually going into this sedimentation basin. And that's really important because it takes out a lot of the fine silt. And then it's distributed evenly to the cells. And then when that actually reaches capacity, the plants absorb the water and the soil absorbs the water, then if you get, say, more than the 1.2-inch storm, which was the storm event that we designed to, then the water will go into the sand filter. And then it will eventually overflow into the canal. But that's after it's been cleaned, as I said. So we used plants that have phytoremediative qualities. They can actually help to break down the biological toxins in the soil, and they can also help to absorb some of the heavy metals in the soil. We had specific plants that were designed or that do that, that were selected to do that, and it would create this whole new open space. Let's go next. So this is it in construction. You can see these cells are huge. It was really cool. Let's go next. We'll just go through these quick. And here they are going in. We ended up taking out the walls in between them because we didn't need it. It was just extra material. Let's go next. This is just, here it is filling up with this really specially engineered soils that took us like a year to make, which is kind of crazy. But let's go next. And there it is, sort of done in the fall. But it was fall, so it didn't look nice. But it'll look really nice this spring. And that was from the New York Times. They took that picture. We're really excited because this actually captures 2 million gallons of stormwater every year. So it could really have an incredible impact. And the Department of Transportation and the Department of City Planning are now looking at implementing this everywhere in New York City for every street end. So we've subverted the system. We've sort of worked around every agency. We've managed to get all of their approvals. And now we've created a new form of urban infrastructure for New York. So architects can infiltrate the engineering community, right? We have the potential. Let's go next. It just takes a lot of time. I joke that it took 8 years of planning and 8 weeks to build. So there are 7,200 miles of bridges and elevated highways that run through U.S. cities. Let's go next. And there are 666 miles of elevated structures in New York City. You can see all the yellow on that map. Next. 2 years ago, I was the Design Trust's Urban Design Fellow, and we looked at these 666 miles and came up with a number of different typologies for how to transform these existing elevated structures. Next. We looked for geographic distribution across New York City. Next. And then also looked for typological strategies, basically different operations for different types of things that could happen. Clover was more of an ecological approach for the large clover leaf, whereas landing was really something about the threshold to Chinatown. And the train really had a lot to do with noise and managing those consequences. With cluster, we had so many different forms of infrastructure coming together that a lot of the project had to do with wayfinding and how to sort of make place out of this really disjointed area. Let's go next. So we also looked at the age of the infrastructure because that might help us prioritize where the public agencies might want to put their money and how they might want to figure out where they were going to operate first. Next. And on the Gowanus Expressway, we had a particular opportunity of a very large highway next to an area that is becoming a new, exciting technology center. But it's also fairly close to the Gowanus, which is developing as more of a residential neighborhood, and it's displacing some of the light industry and art studios that exist there. So we felt a need, and we saw space. Let's go next. So we thought, why not take the parking away from underneath this huge elevated structure, next, and maybe put in some green infrastructure, taking the water off of the raised highways, which is something I had developed in a prior project. And then also think about how this space could be used for light industry. It could be used for artist studios. It could be used for things that where you have to make noise and make mess. Let's go next. And then it might have a longer-term life as a permanent installation with studios or even gallery space existing underneath the highway, because we do have these adjacent uses of this industrial space that's becoming this new technology and art space right next door. Next. And this is just an illustration of that under the elevated reclaiming of public space. Next. And then over at Broadway Junction, which is one of the cluster projects that I talked about, let's go next. What we were thinking about is how to really transform this space. There's a lot of space and it's quite beautiful with this very filtered light, but right now there's nowhere to occupy and you can't really tell where you're going. So we thought about some of the strategies that we could use to help understand what direction you're going in, using color and how we could actually bring in some more green space and some more seating. Next. And then one of the big issues that I was exploring, probably the reason I was chosen as the Design Trust Fellow, was that I was looking at the water that comes off of the raised highways. And you can see this is the problem. This is not a natural water body. This is just a really large puddle, and there's nowhere for it to go. And it's really kind of toxic water. Next. So what I want to do is actually take the water and put it into what we called a Holds scupper. So there are these downspouts that come off the raised highways, and the water has nowhere to go. Next. In some places, there aren't even catch basins. So we developed a number of different typologies. And these are a couple. One is a sort of cellular technology using concrete, and then this other one that was made of gabions. Next. And you can see in each case, it's kind of there's a sedimentation basin and what it amounts to a large planting area. Next. And here you can see one in construction. One of the tricky things in this case was to enable or to have the State Department of Transportation allow us to actually touch their pipes. But happily, there were some landscape architects on their staff who said, just let her try it. It's a pilot. We can always turn it back. And because of that, they let us try it, and it's actually working. Next. But unfortunately, when you create nature in the city, you create nature in the city. You create good habitat. And this muskrat moved into our green infrastructure system, our hold system. And he moved into this big area that we had it was a big concrete sort of cell that we had for monitoring each of the projects. For the Sponge Park and these holds projects, we're monitoring how much water goes in, how much water comes out, and then how clean it is going in or how dirty it is going in, and hopefully how clean it is coming out. So in each of these cases, the monitoring equipment has to be in a big vault. And this muskrat moved into the vault, and it would have been fine except he was chewing up our equipment and leaving candy wrappers and all this junk in there. So we had to muskrat-proof our project, and we didn't bring in the bobcat. He's just there for scale, but hopefully that habitat will develop as well. Let's go next. So there are 35 million U.S. residents that live within 100 meters of a four-lane highway. Next. And my vision when I started my firm had to do with Robert Moses's work on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway and trying to ameliorate some of those impacts by creating a large park in Cobble Hill and Carroll Gardens. Next. So I got a grant to look at this, and I studied the economics of even putting in, say, 350 trees, which I discovered would create a $50 million gain over 10 years in terms of pollution control and water recycling and shade value. And this was at a time where people weren't really talking about the value of landscape, or they'd only just started to visualize and quantify these things. We found this Forest Service document that had done this study that gave us the data, but it wasn't sort of out there in the public realm. And I'm happy to say that 10 years later, this kind of message is starting to permeate more of popular culture. Next. But, back to Robert Moses. Some of the things that Robert Moses did early on were very good in terms of creating lots of playgrounds and open spaces for people of all economic brackets. Next. But unfortunately, he also created landscapes like this. This is the Cross Bronx Expressway. Next. And oftentimes he would go into communities and present these beautiful parkways with park space on either side. Next. And then this is what was actually delivered for that same site. So there's no beautiful parkway. It's really just a 6-lane highway in a trench next to what was a brownstone neighborhood. Next door, or next slide. And these trenches actually create these physical boundaries. And he not only created these highways going through, but also a lot of the bridges that touch down in the neighborhoods, all in the name of progress. Next. So when I started, I was working in Cobble Hill and Carroll Gardens, which is on the bottom part of the slide. And then that work got the attention of a councilwoman, Diana Reyna, who hired us to do a project in Southside Williamsburg, which is a primarily Latino neighborhood up in northern part of Brooklyn. Next. So it's an area that's plagued, unfortunately, by gang violence, and the trench actually creates a territory between the Dominican gangs and the Puerto Rican gangs. Next. And we also examined some of the public health issues in relation to the trench. You can see those dark areas on this asthma map are places that have high asthma rates. There is a low physical activity rate in our neighborhood, and also it has a high level of neighborhood poverty. Next. It's also an active recreation desert. You have to go pretty far to get to playing fields for your teenage kids. Thus, the teenagers end up in the gangs. Next. And so we went through a very extensive community engagement process to develop a program for this park. This is Diana Reyna at one of the community meetings. Next. And what the community told us was that they really wanted playing fields. So we ended up designing a baseball field and then a flexible area that could be a soccer field between the two fields, or if you used both fields. And then some more lush landscapes on either side, and we kept some basketball courts and some play areas. Next. And created this whole kind of verdant cap for the highway. Now, this isn't, this is done in lots of parts of the world, but it's been kind of hard to get it done in New York City because it takes a lot of political will to make something like this happen, and the political will tends to happen in more affluent neighborhoods, not in Southside Williamsburg. Next. But we're trying. And so we looked at the feasibility of this in terms of the spans. Next. And what we discovered was that we needed to keep the deck actually fairly thin. So the program that we had proposed of putting the field turf over the center portion was actually ideal because it doesn't have a lot of weight, and so we could keep the structure fairly thin. And then in those zones, we could actually touch down in the center with an intermediate structure, and that meant that we also didn't need to have such a thick structure. And this was important because we had to bring the project up to federal highway standards, so we needed to have 16 feet of clearance. Next. We also looked at the construction of the BQE and saw that it was done in phases, and we recognized that this section of the BQE was built in 1950. Now, these highways generally have about a 50-year lifespan, so it's time to rebuild a number of the bridges. Next. So we thought we could create an enabled economy. Basically, each of these bridges costs about $10 million to rebuild, so we thought, let's go next, that we could rebuild those bridges, each for $10 million, so a $30 million city investment, and then use that to leverage against a $70 million federal, state, or private grant sort of fund. So that was our idea for this enabled economy as a way to make this happen. Next. So we'd turn this passive open space, next, into a more active component of the community. Next. So there are 20,000 miles of rail trails in the United States, and the Queensway is adding another 3.5 miles. This is a project we're about to start, but the work I'm going to show you is from a feasibility study that we did in partnership with WXY, which is an urban design firm, 2 years ago. Next. And we did this work for the Trust for Public Land and an organization called the Friends of the Queensway. We're adding 40 acres of, actually 47 acres of new park space to New York City along this 3.5 mile long linear park. Next. This is the current condition. It's a former rail line. Next. But it also has places like this, which are so beautiful. This is the middle of New York City, and that exists. So we want to, capture that and accentuate that. Next. So the park has a lot of different characteristics along its length. On the northern part, we're creating something we call the clearing. Then we have these areas we call passages, and we call them that because they're houses that are very close to the Queensway. And so we want those to be places that people might move more quickly through. Like if you're on your bike or you're jogging, we don't want people to linger there, so there isn't a lot of program space in those zones. And then we have the Metropolitan Hub, which is the first section we're going to be working on. Forest Grove Park, which goes through an existing park. South Passage, which again is one of those fast zones. And then the Elevated, which has a structure very similar to the High Line. But this is not West Chelsea. It's not fancy. It's one of the poorest areas of the city. So the challenge is, how do you transform the space and make it a public space without having, a $100 million budget for that piece? Next, because it will be a $100 million project. So we were talking about this in the car today. So CB9 and CB10 are the most diverse in the city. And I think this may actually be one of the most diverse places in the entire world. Because when you think about it, where do you get this many different cultures actually coming together in basically an area where there are 322,000 people within a mile? It's kind of remarkable. Let's go next. So we looked at different programs that could exist along the Queensway and what was possible, and we had a whole series of community meetings to come up with this program. Next. And then also really looked at the existing conditions, and you can see that it's very different. On the top part, it's kind of on a mound, and in the middle, it seems like it's in a ravine, and then on the bottom, it's in a structure. Next. And part of the reason that exists is that the center part, the ravine part, is where the train actually cut through the terminal moraine of the Wisconsin glaciers. So there's a geologic element that the technology actually pierced through. And so we're using that as part of the design inspiration for the material qualities of the site, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. But the other thing that we're thinking about in relation to these material qualities and the physical sort of design of the space and how to make it more beautiful and functional is that there are these huge, gorgeous trees, and we're going to keep them. And there's a lot of understory that has poison ivy and sort of not nice ground cover landscape. So we're going to try to clear a lot of that out and clear out the invasive non-native species, add seating in places where you might have shade, but you happen to be adjacent to the Little League field, and then also add these sort of moments where you might have a blast of color seasonally. So there'd be a kind of reason or a moment that you'd want to visit. And then in the southern portion, really thinking about how this can be a public space that can be used by everybody. It can be used by the workers in the area for lunch, or it can be used by some of the adjacent schools who don't have any open space at their schools. And the teachers, the Board of Ed requires that the teachers walk them around the block so that they get the required exercise for the day. It's really sad. So this could be a new resource for that community. Next. So this is the existing condition in the northern part. That earth mover is not actually doing anything. It just was there, which was kind of funny. Next. And this is our idea of transformation of this space. You can see we created these stone walls, and part of that is a glacial reference, thinking about the glacial till that was left behind when the glaciers retreated. And part of it is a cultural reference, because the early Dutch farms that were in the area created walls to define their farm boundaries using those same stones. So we want to start to draw that out. And then we also have a really significant functional problem in this area of stormwater management. So we're going to create this new water body, which is actually a stormwater management landscape. Next. We're going to capitalize on the neglect. We have these huge trees, so we're going to, keep them. So we have this nice shady area to watch the ball game. Next. And then, as I said, create these pass-through zones. We spent a lot of time sort of designing this pathway so that we could be far enough from the houses and enable privacy, but have it so that you would still feel safe when you were on the path. And one of the things that was important or significant that we noticed was that some of the buildings were parallel to the Queensway and some of the buildings were perpendicular. And so we had the path closer to the buildings that were parallel so that fewer houses were actually impacted by the pathway going through the site. Let's go next. It's just a little thing, but it's what we do as designers, right? Next. So we tried to accentuate the site to create better year-round use of Forest Park, adding some of these understory elements and creating a new access point down from what's called Victory Field, which is an athletic field. Next. And then also created educational opportunities with these learning landscapes, these outdoor classrooms that could exist along the trail. Next. To create this new urban greenway for what we like to say for real New Yorkers. But hopefully tourists will visit too. But next. So 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. Next. In 2010, we were participants in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, partnered with Architecture Research Office. And we were tasked with preparing for basically sea level rise in New York City. And what that graph shows is the level of sea level rise based on rapid ice cap melt. So we're assuming 6 feet of sea level rise and a potential 18-foot storm surge. And you can see that's what you see in this map of the green. Next. My team was asked to look at Lower Manhattan. Let's go next. You can see our model in the beginning. So Manhattan has undergone an incredible transformation over the last 400 years. And when you look at the original edge, it was much, much smaller than it used to be. But it was kind of this rocky edge that really didn't facilitate shipping. So what we did over time was build it out and harden the edges and create these slips. And then ultimately, by 1960, create these finger piers that went out into the water. Next. But with the advent of containerized shipping, by 2010, all that shipping had gone out of New York City proper, and the highest and best use of the land was for recreation and residential use. And during the Bloomberg administration, there was a huge push to build more residential properties all along the waterfront, not just in Lower Manhattan. Next. But if you look at this hydrologic map of 1845, created by Egbert Ville, you can see that the light green looks pretty close to that 1650 map. And that's your upland zone. That whole sort of orangey area is fill. And the other thing to note is that the lighter green area is marshland that has all been contained over time. Next. But if you look at the value at risk, basically this is a map of 6 feet of sea level rise and an 18-foot Category 2 storm surge. You can see, again, that 1625 water line keeps coming back, right? So if we just go back to that 1625 water line, we're all set. But we have a lot of valuable real estate in between, so we need to make some changes. Next. So we looked at the existing seawall in 2010. Next. Looked at it in 2100. Next. Looked at it with the Category 2 storm surge inundation. Next. And then also analyzed the location of the existing storm combined sewer overflow locations. Next. Remember that from Gowanus. And then thought about a system where the water might come in, but it would also go out. We're trying to deal with the freshwater flows out, but then also consider how we can block some of the water coming in, or if it does come in, how we get that out. Next. To create this new urban ground. So we're really looking at that area outside of the 1625 water line where we can create a new kind of operation. Next. So we created these level 1 streets for absorption. Next. What we did was take all of the infrastructure out of the street bed and make the streets permeable. And then I put the public utilities on one side of the sidewalk and the private utilities on the other side. Now, clearly, you'd have to figure this all out, but how it all worked. But what that did was unlock 27% of the city to become permeable. So you're making this whole new permeable ground that can absorb all the surface water runoff. Next. Then we created these level 2 streets for distribution and collection, so these could hold more water. Next. And an important part of this was that the infrastructure that was under the sidewalk could be accessed by vaults, so that if it ever broke or became obsolete, you could just replace it without having to rip up the street. Next. We had level 3 streets for protection. Now, if you had a big flood, this is where a lot of that water would go. So these would both protect and also hold a lot of water. Next. And this is something that we're now doing. We're redesigning 25 blocks of New Orleans. And so we're actually creating these kinds of landscapes for the St. Roch neighborhood. Next. But this whole system creates a whole porous green street system. Next. And then we added this new 6-foot hardened edge. Next. And then a series of waterfront parks. Next. Freshwater wetlands. Next. And then salt marshes along the edge, all to manage different types of stormwater. Next. To create an entire resilient system. Next. This is it along the Hudson River. We call this the Hudson River Urban Estuary. Next. And you can see how this creates a new kind of edge for Manhattan. It's a crenellated edge that has blocks of development and blocks of protective wetland or protective open space. Next. And you can see how you could have small boat craft and you could have the water actually integrating into the urban fabric. Next. Down on the Battery, we had what we called the Battery breakwater. Next. The Battery breakwater also allows for the small craft, and it would sort of develop over time in the shallows. Next, as a protective landscape. And then over on the east side, we had next what we called the East River Esker and breakwater. We had a large mound that would create this protective barrier. Next. And this, what we call, in this East River estuary, you'd have these walkways that could go out over that landscape. Next. And then also these sponge slips, which were these upland areas in the former slip spaces where the ships used to exchange goods. But here it would be a place of ecological exchange. We used plants that could withstand periodic inundation from saltwater, so they could get flooded and then be okay and become public open spaces again in fairly short order after a storm. Next. To create this new resilient city. Next. Now, after we did this, we started looking at sort of global models for how this might work. Next. And we thought about how you have reef ecologies in certain areas. Next. And mangrove ecologies. Next. Maritime forest ecologies, because you can't use the same ecological system for different regions, right? It doesn't work. So you have to think about what your strategies are, what your materials are, how you can operate. Next. And then we developed these different typologies for different areas, from basically the Brooklyn Navy Yard to Shanghai to Miami, and then some of the informal settlements of Bangladesh. Next. And one of the things that we were looking at in Miami was this tourist economy and how it could be impacted so greatly in Miami Beach. Now people are paying a lot of attention to this. Next. Because it's a quite scary situation, because the whole city is sitting on limestone, and you have the saltwater meeting potentially the freshwater aquifer of the Everglades, and there's very little topography that's actually dividing those two systems. So something has to be done to keep them separate, or we're going to have a kind of ecological disaster which will destroy that economy. So we were looking at some ideas for how landscape might help with that, with the creation of this new topography that'll use that mangrove ecology. Next. And another area that was a little bit terrifying, given all the political strife globally, is the Nile River Delta, which is really the breadbasket for an entire region. And as that area becomes smaller and smaller, you're basically going to have a population that's going to have to find a new food source, because a third of the delta is going to be inundated with saltwater over the next 30 years. So it's a potential political disaster waiting to happen that I don't think is getting enough attention worldwide. Next. So, but back in New York, so 2 years later, as we're doing all this research and thinking about global strategies, we had this storm called Sandy, and this was what happened. Next. And basically, Sandy flooded everywhere we said it was going to flood. Next. And it turned the lights out in New York for 3 weeks, which was, I think it cost the city something like $50 billion. So people started really paying attention and doing things to make the city more storm-proof. Next. And so there were proposals for floodgates, of course, huge engineered solutions. Next. And this is what they look like. Next. And you know, those traditional methods can work up to a certain point, but when they fail, they really fail bad. They fail catastrophically. So we wanted to think about some more incremental approaches, next, and maybe less expensive approaches of some of these reconstructed edge conditions, next. And we're actually also thinking about how maybe people shouldn't necessarily be living in some of these more vulnerable zones. So we did this economic analysis of the city, next. And the red is expensive and the blue is cheap, and thought about how maybe what we do is actually do a zoning swap. We created this thing called Zone Air. So Zone A is the area that got inundated really badly by the storm. So this was our little play on words, Zone Air, next. And the thought was that you could capture the value of some higher real estate areas with an upzoning, and then use that value to relocate people away from these waterfront zones, but then also create a permanent fund to take care of these waterfront edges. So it was an idea for relocation and maintenance that could create a permanent fund to take care of this new form of green infrastructure, because one of the things that has sort of thwarted my efforts to create more green infrastructure is that the long-term maintenance costs need to be factored into the overall project costs. Next. So we're also working on this marshes project. This is part of our work post-Sandy. Next. This is a creation of a wetland mitigation bank in Staten Island. Next. And it's basically creating a financial instrument where this landscape, this is what it looks like now, next, and this is what it's being turned into. The performance of this landscape is being measured and valued, and then people who are doing work in other areas where they might be doing environmental harm can actually buy credits in this. But they may also be doing work that's potentially environmentally harmful that's also protecting something like the New York Stock Exchange. So it's important to create mechanisms like this to enable the kind of work that needs to happen to protect some of the valuable assets of the city. Next. And then we're also doing some work on New York Rising, protecting some of the suburban communities in the surrounding area. This is actually a state effort. Next. But let's go next. So there are 39 million acres of roads and parking lots. And I'd like to quote Joni Mitchell on this. They paved paradise and they put up a parking lot. If you go to the next slide, we might have might be a little loud.
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. With a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Sorry, I need that so I can have a drink of Coke. Let's go next. So this is not in New York City. This is in St. Louis. It also woke you all up, right? And I'm almost done. So this is in St. Louis. It's in the Grand Center. Let's go next. We're in Missouri. It's an area that has a ton of parking lots, and we're actually taking one away and turning it into a public open space. Next. We're tying into an art walk that's being created in the area. Next. The art walk is between the public radio station and the public television station, and I worked with one of my Harvard classmates, Ben Gilmartin, on this project, and he's now the design director at DSR, but he was doing this as an experiment to see if he wanted to go out on his own. But then they made him design director, so he said, okay, I'll stay. But in any case, so it's this awful parking lot. Let's go next. And we are transforming it into this new media plaza. And you can see it's this kind of diagonal landscape with, or diagonal plaza with a kind of stepped landscape in the back. Next. We used a lot of native plantings and tried to create a lot of seasonal interest across the year. It's a kind of prairie kind of landscape. Next. And here you can see an example of what that looks like. We also were kind of playing with the idea of, well, some of these aren't native, but we needed the R, the red of the Japanese bloodgrass. But we were trying to create this kind of RGB landscape playing on the digital theme. Next. Here, some wall plantings. and the stepped amphitheater. So we're creating a space that can be used for performance, but it can also be used day to day. Next. And here you can see the media component. There's broadcasting coming from the public television station and also from the public radio station, and it's going into this plaza. And it's created an incredible public space because people come sort of on a day-to-day basis to kind of see what's playing on the screens. But then you can also have a kind of one-on-one experience because there's a URL code built into the screen pattern. So you could go over and kind of choose your programming of your own personal little kiosk. Next. And here you can see it's being used for a fashion show and for some other kind of public event. Next. During Fashion Week. And this is just a view of that stepped amphitheater. Next. And another one. Creating the connection. So we did this project, and now we're actually working for the Sheldon, which is an art museum, which is right behind this project, doing a big art wall. And we also applied for a grant and got them, I think, $300,000 to design a new parking lot, ironically. But the parking lot's going to absorb stormwater, and it's also going to have a lighter color, so it'll have a high albedo, so it won't be so hot in the summer. So it's an environmentally conscious parking lot, and it will ultimately become an annex building for the Sheldon in the long term, but in the short term, it's going to improve the environment of the area. Next. This is it at night. Next. One more. And this one's kind of fun. I did the American Pavilion for the Milan Expo, and after I was with Chris in Berlin, I went and visited the expo back in October before it came down. But what we did was create this vertical farm, which was, if you remember back to those early slides that I showed of Thomas Jefferson's land ordinance grid, this is a reflection of that, but also a reflection of the change in attitudes we have about agriculture and also about food. And it has to do with both microclimate and thinking about local food systems. Next. And here it is, an image. This is not a rendering. This is actually existing. And that flag was done by Michael Beirut at Pentagram before you start to criticize it. But it was this huge vertical farm that creates about 6,000 pounds of produce every week. Next. And here you can see we had 50 different crops, and they were on these louvered systems. It was really cool, sort of seeing it all move. It was very expo, but because it didn't need to louver, but it did, and it made it fun. It was amazing how well these plants could grow. Next. And it also created this really beautiful kind of effect on the inside. We used a system that was developed by this agronomist from the University of Wyoming called a zip grow system, and we integrated all of the irrigation. It's a hydroponic system. We integrated that into the structure, so you didn't see any pipes or anything. It was very seamless. Next. And here you can see the effect of the wall. We used all these heritage seeds and 50 different, as I said, 50 different kinds of vegetables and fruits. Next. And I just want to give credit, and this is the second to last slide. So this is the guy, Nate Story, from Bright Agritech, and he told me a really funny story. Well, there are two stories. One, he took me to a greenhouse that was owned by this guy named Hayden Christensen, and Hayden's this young kid, and he has a greenhouse, and he's actually making a living out of this greenhouse out in the suburbs of Denver. And what he does is he uses one of these towers, and he grows the food on the towers, and he puts them on these bases, and he brings them to Whole Food. And apparently, about 60% of the cost of produce production is in packaging. So he basically eliminates 60% of his overhead by using this system and bringing these things to the Whole Food. And you can go and clip your kale right off of the tower. So it's as fresh as it could be, right? So it's kind of a wonderful idea. But the reason I have this slide up and I have mint written here is because I really need a cocktail. No, it's because Nate told me, and I sort of blew my punchline, but Nate told me that one of his big markets is actually working in Miami. Because there's a huge, huge market for mint. So he has these owners of bars who are actually building greenhouses and putting in his zip towers because they use thousands and thousands of pounds of mint every week to make, next slide, mojitos. So it's kind of exciting that his technology, which is agricultural, is actually following the market. So thank you very much.